My name is David, and I used to believe that good people were protected by an invisible shield of decency. That somehow, if you lived quietly and minded your own business, the world would leave you alone. I was wrong about that. Completely and utterly wrong. 3 months ago, I was just another single dad trying to raise his 8-year-old son Tommy in the quiet suburban streets of Maplewood. Every day after school, we would take the same walk to Riverside Park. Tommy would skip ahead with his backpack bouncing, pointing out dogs and asking endless questions about everything he saw. These walks were the best part of my day, a peaceful routine that anchored both of our lives. But on that Tuesday afternoon in October, something felt different. The air carried an unusual tension, like the moments before a thunderstorm breaks. Tommy was more excited than usual, chattering about the science project he wanted to start at the park. I remember thinking how lucky I was to have such a curious, innocent kid. We reached the crosswalk at Pine Street, our usual crossing point to get to the park. The white pedestrian signal was flashing, giving us the right of way. Tommy started to step into the crosswalk when a massive black SUV came screeching around the corner and stopped directly in the middle of our path. The driver was a woman in her 40s with perfectly styled blonde hair and designer sunglasses. She sat behind the wheel of what looked like a brand new Escalade, completely blocking the crosswalk while she talked loudly on her phone. I could hear her voice through the closed windows, sharp and demanding. I approached her window and tapped gently. "Excuse me, ma'am, you are blocking the crosswalk. Could you please move forward or back up so we can cross?" She turned toward me with a look of pure annoyance, as if I had interrupted something incredibly important. She rolled down her window just enough to speak. "I am on an important call. You can walk around," she snapped, then turned away dismissively. Tommy looked up at me with confusion. Other parents with children had gathered behind us, also waiting to cross. The woman continued her phone conversation, gesturing wildly with her free hand, completely ignoring the growing crowd of families she was blocking. "Ma'am, there are children here. The light is going to change soon. Please just move your car a few feet," I said, keeping my voice calm and respectful. That is when she exploded. She ended her phone call and threw open her car door with such force that it swung wide into the crosswalk. Tommy had been standing close to the SUV, and the heavy door caught his right arm between the door and the frame. The sound he made will haunt me forever. A scream of pure pain and terror that cut through the afternoon air like a knife. His small body crumpled to the ground as she slammed the door shut again, trapping his arm for what felt like an eternity before finally opening it. "You stupid kid should have been paying attention," she shouted as Tommy writhed on the pavement, clutching his arm and sobbing. I dropped to my knees beside my son, my hands shaking as I tried to assess the damage. His arm was already swelling, twisted at an unnatural angle. The other parents rushed forward, some calling 911, others creating a protective circle around us. "How dare you hurt my child?" I said, looking up at her from where I knelt beside Tommy. She just shrugged, already climbing back into her SUV. "Maybe next time you will teach him to stay out of the way." The ambulance ride to Memorial Hospital passed in a blur of sirens and Tommy's quiet whimpers. I held his good hand, while the paramedic carefully stabilized his injured arm. The swelling had gotten worse, and dark bruises were already forming around his wrist and forearm. "Dad, why did she hurt me?" Tommy asked through his tears. "I was not doing anything wrong." I did not have an answer. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that some people in this world are simply cruel for no reason at all? That sometimes bad things happen to good people who have done nothing to deserve it? The emergency room at Memorial was busy, but they took Tommy back immediately when they saw his injury. The X-rays revealed a fractured radius and severe soft tissue damage. The doctor, a kind woman named Dr. Martinez, explained that Tommy would need surgery to properly set the bone and would be in a cast for at least 8 weeks. "How did this happen?" she asked as she examined the injury more closely. I told her about the car door incident, watching her expression grow darker with each detail. When I finished, she shook her head in disbelief. This was clearly intentional. The force required to cause this type of fracture with a car door, someone would have had to slam it deliberately, hard. While Tommy was in surgery, I sat in the waiting room trying to process what had happened. The woman, who I later learned was named Karen Mitchell, had not even bothered to stay at the scene. She had driven away while my son was crying on the ground, leaving me to deal with the aftermath of her violence. Officer Reynolds arrived to take my statement about 2 hours after we got to the hospital. He was professional, but seemed skeptical about my account of events. "So you are saying she deliberately slammed the car door on your son's arm?" he asked, scribbling notes on his pad. "Yes, she was angry that I asked her to move her car from the crosswalk. She opened the door hard and fast, right into him." "Did you get her license plate number?" I felt my heart sink. In the chaos of getting Tommy medical attention, I had not thought to memorize her plate, but I had witnesses. 3 other parents had seen the entire incident and confirmed my story when Officer Reynolds interviewed them. "We will file a report and try to locate the vehicle," he said. "But without a plate number and with her already gone from the scene, it might be difficult to pursue charges." That night, after Tommy was settled at home with his new cast and pain medication, I sat alone in my kitchen staring at the incident report. The clinical language on the paper could not capture the horror of watching my child get hurt by someone who felt no remorse whatsoever. I started researching Karen Mitchell online. It took less than an hour to find her social media profiles, her address, and her place of employment. She worked as a real estate agent for a high-end firm downtown, specializing in luxury properties. Her Facebook page was filled with photos of expensive cars, designer clothes, and posts complaining about entitled people who do not know their place. The more I read, the angrier I became. This woman lived in a bubble of privilege and entitlement, completely disconnected from the consequences of her actions. She hurt my son and drove away like he was nothing more than an inconvenience. But what really pushed me over the edge was finding a local neighborhood forum, where dozens of people had posted complaints about Karen Mitchell over the past 3 years. Stories of her aggressive driving, her verbal abuse of service workers, her threats against neighbors who dared to question her behavior. One post from an elderly man described how she had nearly run him down in a crosswalk while screaming at him to get out of her way. She was a predator who had been terrorizing innocent people for years without facing any real consequences. The system had failed to stop her, and now my son was paying the price for that failure. That night, as I checked on Tommy sleeping peacefully in his bed, his casted arm resting on a pillow, I made a decision. If the law would not hold Karen Mitchell accountable for her actions, then I would find another way to make sure she never hurt another child again. The research I had already done was just the beginning. I was going to learn everything there was to know about Karen Mitchell, and then I was going to use that knowledge to destroy her. Over the next 3 weeks, investigating Karen Mitchell became my obsession. Every free moment I had while Tommy was at school or sleeping was spent gathering information about the woman who had hurt my child. What started as simple curiosity evolved into something much more methodical and comprehensive. I discovered that Karen Mitchell lived in Willowbrook Estates, an upscale gated community about 15 minutes from our neighborhood. Her house was a massive colonial on 2 acres, worth well over $1 million according to public records. She drove 3 different vehicles: the black Escalade I had encountered, a red BMW convertible, and a white Mercedes sedan. All of them were leased through her real estate company. Her social media presence revealed a woman obsessed with status and image. Every post was carefully curated to project wealth and success. Photos of expensive restaurants, luxury vacations, designer handbags. But hidden between the glamorous posts were glimpses of her true personality. Angry rants about stupid people who got in her way. Complaints about service workers who did not show proper respect. Threats against neighbors who had the audacity to question her behavior. I spent hours scrolling through local Facebook groups and neighborhood forums, collecting stories about Karen's behavior. The pattern was clear and disturbing. She had been terrorizing people for years with absolutely no consequences. Mrs. Henderson from Elm Street posted about Karen screaming at her elderly husband for walking too slowly in a crosswalk. The owner of Tony's Deli described how Karen had thrown a sandwich at his teenage employee for taking too long with her order. A young mother shared a story about Karen threatening to have her worthless children taken away by social services because they were playing too loudly in their own backyard. But the most revealing discovery came from the Department of Motor Vehicles records that I was able to access through a friend who worked in the county clerk's office. Karen Mitchell had 17 moving violations in the past 5 years. Speeding tickets, reckless driving, running red lights, aggressive driving citations. Her license should have been suspended years ago, but somehow she kept getting reduced sentences and probation. I learned about her daily routines through careful observation. Every morning at 7:30, she left her house in the Escalade and drove aggressively to her office downtown. She always took the same route, cutting through residential neighborhoods to avoid traffic, speeding through school zones, running stop signs when she thought no one was watching. Her lunch routine was equally predictable. Every Tuesday and Thursday, she drove to an upscale spa on the north side of town for what appeared to be standing appointments. She always used the same parking spot in the rear of the building, always stayed for exactly 90 minutes, and always emerged from the spa looking irritated about something. But it was her evening routine that gave me the most insight into her vulnerabilities. Karen Mitchell was obsessed with her cars. Every night when she returned home, she would spend at least 20 minutes in her garage, cleaning and inspecting whichever vehicle she had driven that day. Her social media posts frequently featured photos of her cars, gleaming under professional lighting in her 3-car garage. The cars were not just transportation to her. They were symbols of her power and status. The way she drove them, aggressively and recklessly, was an extension of her personality. She used them as weapons to intimidate and control other people. That realization was when my plan began to take shape. Karen Mitchell had used her vehicle as a weapon against my son. Her aggressive driving was not just a bad habit, it was a deliberate choice to terrorize anyone who got in her way. She had been doing it for years without consequences, becoming more bold and more dangerous with each incident. I started documenting her driving patterns more carefully, following her at a safe distance, noting the routes she took, the violations she committed, the near misses with other pedestrians and drivers. She was an accident waiting to happen, a dangerous predator behind the wheel of a 3-ton weapon. The more I watched her, the more convinced I became that she would eventually kill someone. Maybe an elderly person in a crosswalk, maybe a child riding a bicycle, maybe an entire family if she ran a red light at the wrong moment. But what if her own aggressive driving could be turned against her? What if the very behavior that made her dangerous could become the instrument of her downfall? I began researching traffic patterns, accident statistics, and the physics of high-speed collisions. I studied the routes she took most frequently, looking for the perfect location where her predictable aggression could be manipulated into something more permanent. The plan was starting to form in my mind, and it was beautiful in its simplicity. Karen Mitchell would destroy herself with her own reckless behavior. I would just need to provide the right circumstances. The plan began to crystallize during Tommy's 4th week in his cast. I was helping him with his homework when he looked up at me with those trusting 8-year-old eyes and asked, "Dad, why did the police not arrest the lady who hurt me?" I had been dreading this question. How do you explain to a child that the world is not fair? That sometimes bad people face no consequences for their actions? That the system designed to protect innocent people often fails when it matters most? Sometimes the police need more evidence before they can arrest someone, I said carefully. They are still working on your case. But we both knew the truth. Officer Reynolds had called 3 days earlier to inform me that without additional witnesses or physical evidence, they could not pursue criminal charges against Karen Mitchell. The civil case was still a possibility, but that would take years and might result in nothing more than a financial settlement that Karen could easily afford. Tommy nodded and went back to his math problems, but I could see the disappointment in his face. He was learning one of life's harshest lessons, that justice is not guaranteed, even when you are completely innocent. That night, after Tommy went to bed, I sat in my garage and finalized the details of my plan. I had been monitoring Karen's driving patterns for 3 weeks now, and her behavior was remarkably predictable. Every Tuesday and Thursday, she took the same route to her spa appointment. Maple Street to Pine Avenue, then north on Highway 47 to the Serenity Day Spa. The critical section was a half-mile stretch of Highway 47 where the road curved sharply to the left around Miller's Pond. The speed limit was 35 miles per hour, but Karen consistently took that curve at 55 to 60 miles per hour. I had timed her multiple times. She never slowed down, even in wet conditions. The beauty of the location was its isolation. The curve was surrounded by dense woods on both sides, with no houses or businesses nearby. More importantly, there was a service road that ran parallel to the highway, hidden behind a line of oak trees. A person could park on that service road and have a clear view of the highway curve without being seen by passing traffic. I spent 2 weeks acquiring the materials I would need. Nothing unusual or suspicious, just items that any homeowner might have in their garage. A length of heavy chain from the hardware store, road flares from the automotive section at Walmart, reflective traffic cones that I ordered online. Everything was purchased with cash from different locations to avoid creating a pattern. The internal struggle was the hardest part. I had never hurt another person in my life. I was a software engineer, a quiet suburban father who coached Little League on weekends. The idea of deliberately causing harm to another human being went against everything I believed about myself. But every time I looked at Tommy's cast, every time I saw him struggle to use his right hand, every time he asked when his arm would stop hurting, my resolve strengthened. Karen Mitchell had shown no remorse for hurting my child. She had driven away from the scene without a second thought, leaving him crying on the pavement. She was a predator who would continue hurting innocent people until someone stopped her. I practiced the setup multiple times during the early morning hours when traffic was minimal. The entire process took less than 10 minutes. Position the traffic cones to create a temporary lane closure. Deploy the road flares to force approaching vehicles to slow down and merge left. Then retreat to the observation point on the service road and wait. But Karen Mitchell never slowed down for anything. Her aggressive driving style meant she would see the lane closure as a challenge to be overcome, not an obstacle to be respected. She would accelerate through the merge point, trying to get ahead of any other traffic, taking the curve at dangerous speed while focused on the road hazards instead of what was waiting for her on the other side. The final piece of the plan was the most important: the chain. 20 feet of heavy-duty tow chain, stretched across the highway just past the apex of the curve, anchored to trees on both sides of the road. At her usual speed of 55 miles per hour, Karen's Escalade would hit that chain with enough force to stop the 3-ton vehicle instantly, while her body continued forward at the same speed. The physics were simple and brutal. An object in motion stays in motion unless acted upon by an external force. The chain would be that external force for her vehicle. The windshield would be that external force for her body. I knew there was a chance this plan could go wrong. Other drivers might come along at the wrong time. The chain might not hold. Karen might uncharacteristically decide to drive slowly that day. But I also knew that if I did nothing, she would eventually kill someone. Maybe not today, maybe not next week, but eventually her reckless behavior would result in tragedy. At least this way, the tragedy would be hers alone. Thursday, November 15th, was the day I chose to end Karen Mitchell's reign of terror. The weather forecast called for clear skies and dry roads, perfect conditions for her predictably aggressive driving to the spa. I had monitored her routine for over a month, and she had never deviated from her schedule. Every Thursday at 12:30 p.m., she would leave her office in the black Escalade and speed toward her appointment. I arrived at the service road at 11:45 a.m., giving myself plenty of time to set up and mentally prepare for what was about to happen. The woods were quiet except for the distant sound of traffic on Highway 47. No hikers, no maintenance workers, no unexpected witnesses to complicate the plan. Setting up the traffic cones and road flares took exactly 8 minutes, just as I had practiced. The lane closure looked official and legitimate, the kind of temporary hazard that highway departments create dozens of times each week. Any reasonable driver would slow down, merge carefully, and proceed with caution. But Karen Mitchell was not a reasonable driver. I positioned the chain at the exact spot where my calculations indicated her vehicle would be traveling fastest coming out of the curve. The heavy link stretched taut between two oak trees, invisible to approaching traffic until it was too late to react. 20 feet of hardened steel that would end her violent career in a single moment. From my hidden position on the service road, I had a perfect view of the entire setup. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the trees, creating a pattern of light and darkness that would help conceal the chain until the final second. Everything was ready. At 12:28 p.m., I heard the familiar roar of Karen's engine approaching from the south. She was 2 minutes early, probably because she had cut through more school zones and residential neighborhoods than usual to make up time. The sound grew louder as she approached the curve. The Escalade's powerful engine pushed to its limits as always. I could see her vehicle now, the black SUV moving far too fast for the posted speed limit. She hit the temporary lane closure at nearly 60 miles per hour, exactly as I had predicted. Instead of slowing down, she accelerated into the merge, trying to get around the road flares as quickly as possible. For a moment, I felt a flicker of doubt. This was my last chance to call it off, to step out of the woods and wave her down, to find some other way to make her pay for what she had done to Tommy. The rational part of my mind screamed that this was wrong, that I was about to become the very thing I hated about her. But then I remembered the sound Tommy made when that car door crushed his arm. I remembered her callous shrug as she climbed back into her SUV, leaving my child crying on the pavement. I remembered all the other victims she had terrorized over the years, all the people who had suffered, because no one had the courage to stop her. Karen Mitchell was a predator who used her wealth and privilege to avoid consequences. She had hurt my son without remorse and would continue hurting others until someone made her stop. Today, someone finally would. The Escalade came around the curve at 55 miles per hour, just as my calculations had predicted. Karen was focused on the road ahead, probably already planning how she would berate the spa staff for some imagined slight. She had no idea that her life was about to end in the most violent and sudden way possible. The chain caught the front of her vehicle at bumper level, exactly where I had positioned it. The sound was incredible, like a thunderclap mixed with the screech of tearing metal. The 3-ton SUV stopped instantly, as if it had hit a concrete wall. But Karen's body, traveling at 55 miles per hour, continued forward according to the laws of physics that govern all moving objects. She went through the windshield face first, her body becoming a missile launched by her own reckless driving. The safety glass exploded outward in a shower of glittering fragments, each piece catching the afternoon sunlight as it fell to the asphalt around the destroyed vehicle. For a moment, everything was perfectly silent except for the hiss of escaping steam from the Escalade's ruptured radiator. Karen's body hung half in and half out of the windshield, motionless and twisted at an impossible angle. Blood streamed down the spider web cracks in what remained of the glass, pooling on the dashboard and dripping onto the leather seats she had been so proud of. I stood in the woods watching the scene, feeling a complex mixture of satisfaction and horror. Karen Mitchell would never hurt another child. She would never terrorize another elderly person in a crosswalk. She would never threaten another family or abuse another service worker. The predator was finally dead. The silence that followed the impact was profound and unsettling. No sound came from the destroyed Escalade except the steady drip of fluids leaking onto the asphalt and the occasional groan of settling metal. Karen's body remained motionless, half ejected through the windshield, her designer clothes torn and bloodied. I stood frozen in the woods for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Part of me could not believe I had actually gone through with the plan. The mild-mannered software engineer who had never even been in a fist fight had just orchestrated the violent death of another human being. The magnitude of what I had done was overwhelming. But another part of me felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This woman had deliberately hurt my child and shown no remorse. She had terrorized innocent people for years while the system failed to stop her. Now she would never hurt anyone again. I forced myself to move, to begin the cleanup process I had planned so carefully. The traffic cones and road flares were quickly gathered and stored in the duffel bag I had brought. The chain was more difficult to remove, tangled as it was in the wreckage of Karen's vehicle, but I managed to free it after several minutes of careful work. By the time I heard the first approaching sirens in the distance, I was back on the service road, loading the evidence into my car. To any passing motorist, I looked like a county worker cleaning up after a routine road maintenance project. Nothing suspicious or memorable. The drive home took 12 minutes, exactly the same amount of time it had taken every other day that week. I forced myself to maintain normal speed and follow all traffic laws, despite the adrenaline surging through my system. Getting pulled over for a speeding ticket would create the kind of connection between myself and the crime scene that could prove problematic later. At home, I stored the chain and cones in my garage, mixed in with the other tools and equipment that any suburban homeowner might own. The road flares went into the trash, buried beneath kitchen garbage and lawn clippings. Everything was hidden in plain sight, part of the normal clutter of domestic life. Tommy was at school when I arrived home, which gave me time to shower and change clothes before picking him up. I needed to look and act completely normal, like a father who had spent his afternoon running errands, not orchestrating a murder on a lonely stretch of highway. The news of Karen's death broke on the local evening news while Tommy and I were eating dinner. The anchor described it as a tragic single-vehicle accident on Highway 47, caused by excessive speed and reckless driving. The reporter interviewed a state trooper, who explained that the victim had been traveling nearly 60 miles per hour in a 35-mile-per-hour zone when she lost control on the curve. Preliminary investigation suggests the driver was attempting to navigate around temporary road construction when the accident occurred, the trooper said. Speed appears to have been the primary factor in this fatal crash. Tommy looked up from his spaghetti when he heard the news report. "Dad, that is the lady who hurt my arm." I kept my expression neutral, despite the surge of emotion I felt at his words. "Yes, son. It looks like she was driving too fast and had an accident." "Is she going to jail now?" he asked innocently. "No, Tommy. She died in the accident. She will not be hurting anyone anymore." He nodded and went back to his dinner, seemingly satisfied with this resolution. For him, it was simple justice. The person who had hurt him was gone, and the world was a safer place because of it. Over the following days, I watched the investigation unfold with careful attention. The police found no evidence of foul play, no witnesses to contradict the single-vehicle accident theory. Karen's history of aggressive driving and multiple traffic violations supported the conclusion that she had simply been driving too fast and lost control. The local newspaper ran a brief obituary describing Karen as a successful businesswoman who had died tragically in a traffic accident. There was no mention of her history of terrorizing neighbors, her assault on my son, or the dozens of complaints that had been filed against her over the years. But I knew the truth, and that was enough. Karen Mitchell had paid the ultimate price for her years of casual cruelty. The system had failed to hold her accountable, so I had taken matters into my own hands. Justice had finally been served. 6 months have passed since Karen Mitchell's death, and the transformation in our community has been remarkable. The aggressive driving that had terrorized our neighborhood for years simply stopped. Children can cross the street safely now. Elderly residents no longer fear walking to the mailbox. The atmosphere of intimidation that Karen had created is gone, replaced by the peaceful suburban life we had all hoped for. Tommy's arm healed completely, leaving only a thin scar that serves as a permanent reminder of what Karen did to him. But more than his physical healing, I have watched my son's emotional recovery with pride and relief. The fear and confusion that haunted him after the attack gradually faded, replaced by his natural curiosity and joy. "Dad, my arm does not hurt anymore," he told me last week while we were playing catch in the backyard. "It is stronger now than before." I smiled at his words, knowing they carried deeper meaning than he realized. Sometimes we have to be broken before we can become truly strong. The investigation into Karen's death was officially closed 3 months ago. The final report concluded that excessive speed and reckless driving were the sole factors in her fatal accident. No charges were filed. No further investigation was deemed necessary. Case closed. I still drive past the crash site occasionally, though the county has since improved the curve with better signage and guardrails. There is no memorial marker, no flowers left by grieving friends or family. Karen Mitchell has been forgotten by everyone except the people she hurt, and we remember her only as a cautionary tale. The other parents in our neighborhood eventually learned what Karen had done to Tommy. Word spread quietly through the community, along with stories of her other victims. Mrs. Henderson shared how Karen had screamed at her elderly husband. The owner of Tony's Deli talked about the sandwich throwing incident. A young mother described Karen's threats against her children. Nobody mourned her passing. If anything, there was a collective sense of relief that the neighborhood bully was finally gone. I have never told anyone about my role in Karen's death, and I never will. Tommy believes she died in an accident caused by her own reckless driving, which is essentially true. The method was different than he imagines, but the cause was exactly what everyone expected. Karen Mitchell's aggressive behavior finally caught up with her in the most permanent way possible. Sometimes I wonder if I should feel guilty about what I did. Society says that taking another person's life is wrong, regardless of the circumstances. But then I remember Tommy's screams when that car door crushed his arm. I remember Karen's callous shrug as she drove away. I remember all the other victims who suffered because no one had the courage to stop her. A parent's first duty is to protect their children. When the system fails, when the law offers no justice, when predators roam free to hurt the innocent, sometimes extraordinary measures become necessary. I did what any loving father would do when faced with a threat to his child's safety. Karen Mitchell chose violence when she slammed that car door on my son's arm. I simply returned that violence to its source, using her own reckless behavior as the weapon. She destroyed herself with the same aggression that had defined her entire adult life. The world is a better place without Karen Mitchell in it. My son is safe. My community is at peace. Justice has been served. That is all that matters.